Mayday Helicopter Stories. Our mission is improve aeronautical safety in order to identify latent failures and effective monitoring of risk mitigation for the prevention of accidents, as well as expanding the knowledge of flight and maintenance personnel by announcing previous events. On March 5, 2021, the Airspan Helicopters Ltd. Airspan Helicopters, Bell 212 helicopter. Registration C-GNYI, was scheduled to depart Sechelt Aerodrome, CAP3, British Columbia, BC, with 2 pilots on board for a Visual Flight Rules (VFR) flight. The helicopter would be heading to a staging area about 21 nautical miles east in Cypress Provincial Park, BC, to complete a multi-day longline project in collaboration with BC Hydro. The plan, once the aircraft arrived at the staging area, was for the second pilot to do the longline work and the pilot in command, PIC, to monitor him as part of a performance evaluation by BC Hydro for the installation of 230 kV high-voltage transmission line structures. Before preparing the helicopter for departure, the pilots checked the available weather resources, which included graphic area forecasts, aerodrome forecasts, aerodrome routine meteorological reports, and the marine forecast issued by Environment and Climate Change Canada. According to the forecasts, moderate, with localized severe, mechanical turbulence and low-level wind shear were expected in the area in which the pilots would be operating. Though the strong winds were a concern, the flight was dispatched with the knowledge that it would be a turbulent flight. The PIC made the decision to depart based on an improving forecast later in the day, the desire to complete the operational flight, and the observation that other aircraft were operating in and out of Sechelt Aerodrome. The second pilot then began to prepare the helicopter for the flight. At approximately 0900 the PIC contacted BC Hydro crews, who had just arrived at the work site in Cypress Mountain Provincial Park, for additional wind information. At 0927, the helicopter was started, and an engine power assurance check was completed. The helicopter then lifted off and headed east toward Cypress Provincial Park at approximately 0935. The PIC was seated in the right seat and the second pilot, who was the pilot flying, was seated in the left seat. The helicopter climbed and established a cruise between 2,300 feet and 2,600 feet above sea level for the next several minutes, encountering light turbulence and variable winds from the east and southeast. As the helicopter flew towards Sechelt Island, BC, the pilots observed localized surface waves, or cat's paws, indicating downdrafts in the area. They discussed the likelihood of increasing turbulence based on those observations. Above the northern tip of Sechelt Island, the second pilot slowed the helicopter to 75 knots indicated airspeed, 66 knots ground speed, and changed its track slightly to the north at approximately 2,600 feet. As the pilots were expecting mechanical turbulence coming from Bowen Island, which has a peak elevation of 2,388 feet. The helicopter's speed increased as it began crossing Collingwood Channel, reaching a speed of 78 knots ground speed at an altitude of approximately 2,560 feet. As it flew above the channel, the helicopter passed through an area of moderate turbulence. Soon after, at 0945:24, the helicopter was roughly 2 nautic miles west of Bowen Island, on the lee side at an altitude of approximately 2,430 feet, when it entered another area of turbulence with a severe downward force. While traveling at a ground speed of 73 knots on a track of approximately 110 degrees, the helicopter violently pitched nose down and began a rapid right roll. The cyclic was momentarily pulled from the second pilot's hand due to the aircraft's violent, rapid movement. The helicopter rolled inverted, or close to inverted, during this loss of control, and the PIC joined the second pilot on the controls to attempt a recovery. The second pilot applied maximum aft cyclic in the recovery attempt. During this period, the helicopter fell approximately 1,400 feet to an altitude of approximately 1,040 feet, a descent rate of 8,220 feet per minute. Several items, such as a spare headset, handheld radio, flight manual, and lunchbox, were launched forward from the rear cabin and struck the pilots on their helmets. The visor cover and yellow visor on the second pilot's helmet were knocked down over his face, blocking his vision momentarily. With the PIC also on the controls, the second pilot was able to let go of the flight controls momentarily in order to force the visor cover up off his face and out of his vision. The yellow visor remained down for the remainder of the flight. Several gauges broke from their mounts during the violent descent. These gauges slid from their seated position within the instrument panel. The pilots were able to regain some control of the helicopter 0.6 nm east of Bowen Island and 1 nm from Keats Island, maintaining the helicopter on an easterly heading. Observers on the ground saw a puff of gray smoke come from the helicopter as it leveled off. Moments after the helicopter had leveled off, both pilots were still struggling to use the controls, and they noticed that the anti-torque pedals had become very difficult to move and the cyclic was slow to respond to inputs. At that time, the pilots observed a hydraulic caution light indicating a drop in hydraulic pressure below an acceptable threshold for operations. Due to the high workload of trying to control the helicopter, neither pilot had the opportunity to look at the instruments to determine whether the number 1 or number 2 hydraulic system had failed. The pilots selected a large field on the northwest corner of Bowen Island as an emergency landing site. The PIC then observed the number 2 engine out indication light illuminate when the helicopter was at an altitude of approximately 900 feet ASL and 1.2 nm from the proposed landing site. He communicated an engine out indication to the second pilot, but did not specify which engine had the indication, causing some uncertainty as to which engine was working. The second pilot glanced at the caution lights but was unable to ascertain which engine light was on while he was maintaining control of the helicopter. He then confirmed that both throttles were at maximum power. The controllability of the helicopter, along with a loss of engine power, caused the pilots to revise their choice of landing site to a closer field. On final for the field, the PIC turned on the emergency locator transmitter, ELT, prompting the second pilot to broadcast a mayday call over the radio on frequency 123.20 MHz. The mayday call was heard by other aircraft in the area, but not by air traffic control. As they descended and decelerated, the helicopter began to yaw to the right, resulting in another loss of control. The PIC communicated to the second pilot that they had a tail rotor failure. At approximately 150 feet above the landing site, the second pilot reduced both throttles to the idle position in an attempt to slow the rotation. Moments later, the helicopter began contacting the trees at approximately 310 feet. As tree contact was made, the second pilot pulled up on the collective to slow the descent and cushion the impact. The helicopter dropped and came to rest inverted on a rocky ledge at approximately 270 feet. Fuel lines under the cabin floor panel were compromised during the impact and began leaking fuel onto the pilots, who were still seated in the inverted fuselage, restrained by their safety harnesses. The PIC assisted the second pilot, whose foot was pinned in the footwell, and they both egressed successfully. The pilots were located by locals who had witnessed the accident and rushed to the area to assist. Both pilots were transported to hospital for evaluation. On the morning of the occurrence, strong southeasterly winds were blowing in the vicinity of the accident site. The west side of Bowen Island is dominated by a long ridge which is anchored at the south end by Mount Gardner with an elevation of 2,388 feet. The flight's intended destination, Cypress Provincial Park, is approximately 6 nautical miles east of Bowen Island. Within the park are Mount Strachan with an elevation of 4,714 feet ASL and Black Mountain, with an elevation of 4,016 feet. When the winds blow against a steep cliff or over rugged terrain, gusty turbulent helicopter's configuration. The flight profile resulted in a low G condition on at least 2 occasions. The flight profile resulted in substantial blade flapping. Low-G conditions. A low-G condition is an undesired phase of aerodynamic flight in which the airframe is temporarily unloaded. The helicopter and occupants inside it may experience a temporary feeling of weightlessness. For two-bladed teetering rotor systems, which rely on the tilting of the rotor disc for control, low-G conditions can be catastrophic. The strong winds on the day of the occurrence, mixed with the complex terrain within the inlet, produced severe turbulence that resulted in low-G conditions and a loss of control. During the loss of control, the helicopter experienced extreme attitudes that exceeded the maneuvering limitations outlined in the Bell Model 212 Rotorcraft Flight Manual, RFM. A low-G condition occurs when the main rotor is temporarily unloaded from the forces that are applied during the flight. During this low-G condition, the lateral cyclic has little, if any, effect because the rotor thrust has been reduced. Pilots should respond with smooth, gentle control inputs and avoid over-controlling. The investigation was unable to determine which control inputs were applied by the pilots during the low-G condition. However, aft cyclic was heavily applied at some point during the recovery attempt. The examination of the wreckage found marks on the upper section of the rotor mast, which indicate that a mast bump occurred. This happens in flight when excessive blade flapping occurs and leads to contact between the main rotor hub and the rotor mast. Also, it was determined that the tail rotor drive system was cut by the main rotor blades at some point during the loss of control, leaving the helicopter with a loss of tail rotor thrust. Severe turbulence and a low-G condition are two situations that can cause blades to flap enough to strike the tail boom, according to the Bell Textron Incorporated Comprehensive Program for the Theoretical Evaluation of Rotorcraft, Copter, Simulators Computer Simulations for the flight. The helicopter entered a low-G condition at least twice during the first loss of control.